Good morning, everyone. Global News is tweeting and they're reporting. Would you support stronger measures to further limit the spread of COVID-19 in Canada? And the headline is, Canadians overwhelmingly support stronger measures to fight COVID-19, Ipsos poll suggests. Don't you find it interesting when they pair a headline like that with a question like that? Is that a little bit leading for your comments? Interestingly, though, nobody fell for the loaded question, right? The absolutely weighted, Canadians overwhelmingly support stronger measures. Everybody, or a whole bunch of the comments, say not a chance. And it's funny, they didn't add a poll into this to validate their Ipsos poll, their paid for Ipsos poll. But overwhelmingly, the response is, well, more BS fake news from Global. Here's a Willy Wonka. I can smell your BS from here, right? Moving down, here's somebody who actually posted the poll, and 66% say no. Hashtag end the lockdown now, right? No, 1,000 times no. Nope, government's already pushed our charter rights too far. Enough is enough. Enough is enough is too much. One size fits all does not work. Focus on the most vulnerable groups as demonstrated by their mortality stats and let the rest of us get back to normal. Yeah, there's some strong pushback. Yesterday, during Doug Ford's presser, I heard multiple news outlets asking, what's the plan to reopen things? What is the plan to get things moving again? And, well, here they are. Planning is underway in Toronto on how city could be reopened. And really, the plans are thin at this point in time. Here's the article. CTV News, planning is underway in Toronto on how city could be reopened. Toronto's mayor said the planning is underway to figure out how the city could eventually be reopened, even as MPPs meet at Queen's Park to extend an emergency order requiring the closure of non-essential businesses for another 28 days. Mayor John Tory made the comment during an interview with CP24 on Tuesday morning, noting that he would be participating in a fairly lengthy briefing on the city's recovery plan this afternoon. He said that while any determination on when certain restrictions will be lifted will be made solely on the basis of advice from public health officials. Efforts are being undertaken now to plan for how Toronto could eventually reopen in a, quote, orderly fashion that might even include a celebratory aspect to help encourage the return of residents to suffering businesses. We are planning for it. I don't want people to think that means it will happen tomorrow afternoon, because it won't. But we are very conscious of the fact that people want this. He said, this is why we are saying, please stay home and please stay 2 meters apart from each other so that day can come sooner, he said. And I'll leave that there. There is a concerted push. People are getting tired of this, and the numbers, and people were pushing back at me on Twitter about this, but the projection numbers had 1,000 people in ICU on this yesterday, not this day. We had even more in the projections. And yesterday we had 263 in ICU. And I'm not saying that those people, it's not a tragedy that they're there. And I think that it's, again, the early inaction that led to that. Trudeau's early inaction, our government's early inaction. And the health officials who were relying on for reopening Toronto, right? They've been consistently wrong. They said borders don't work, but the borders of your house work really well to keep the infection rates down, right? And they said that masks don't work until 2 or 3 days ago. And so why are we waiting for these people who have been consistently wrong when we've got examples of economies open with people able to function in a almost normal way, right? It's offensive, but at least they're starting to talk about that. At least they're starting to realize that. Here's the impact. First, I had people pushing back at me on Twitter, just to finish my thought there. And fundamentally, if you have evidence that this thing is what this thing looked like when it was coming out of Wuhan, you have to respond to that. But if your evidence then belies the model, if the model says one thing, 1,000 people in the ICU, and the reality is very different, 200 in the ICU or 260 in the ICU, then you need to follow the reality, the real numbers, right? Like, we can't just follow the models blindly. Like, we have an idea of a treatment that has a very good success rate, multiple studies across the world, Italy, France, Spain, talking about hydroxychloroquine as an effective treatment. So we've got treatment paths, we've got physical barriers, masks, we've got locking down of old age facilities that as a tactic to use. We've got a pathway to returning to some normalcy, and I don't know why. I do know why, but it's the dragging the feet at the government level is frustrating a lot of people, and that's And that's coming into play. And I think people are seeing that. And if the models had turned out to be accurate, if there were 1,000 people in the ICU and we were seeing overwhelmed hospitals, then yeah, we have to reassess at that point too. But that's not happening. Thank goodness that's not happening. That's a good thing. Now, how can we live with this? How do we safely get out of the tree and make sure that we can go on with everyday regular life, right? Like that's the goal. And pushing to open up the economy is responsible. We have to have a plan. We have to do this. We can't cower in our houses for the rest of everyone's life, hoping that we don't get sick, right? That's not a solution. It's not a viable solution for the long term. It's not even a viable solution for into summer. I'm hoping that we can reopen schools. I'm hoping that can happen because the reality of this situation is far different than the models. Okay? That's what I mean. I hope that makes sense. All right, back to this. Jason Kenney, yesterday I talked about okay, well, we'll get into that in a minute. Alberta may circumvent Health Canada to gain access to COVID-19 tests and drugs, Premier says. Albertans should have access to COVID-19 tests, medicines, and vaccines approved by trusted regulators in other countries, Premier Jason Kenney says. On Monday, Kenney said products approved by European or American health regulators should be available for use in Alberta, even while awaiting Health Canada's approval. The direction I've given our officials is if we see a highly credible regulator, medications in a peer jurisdiction like European Union, Australia, or the United States that have approved a test or a vaccine or medication, we should pursue that, he said on CBC Power and Politics. We should not wait for Health Canada to catch up. His comments were an affirmation of a similar tweet he posted on Sunday in response to a story Health Canada was reviewing a blood test already in use in the US to detect COVID-19 antibodies. And this is the tweet. He says, agreed, I have directed our officials to consider use of COVID-19 tests, vaccines, or medications that have been approved by the high standards of at least one credible peer country's drug agency, e.g. EMA News, US FDA. We won't wait for Health Canada, CDA to play catch up. Back to this. Public health experts have said that widespread rapid testing for COVID-19 antibodies could help identify which people have already developed immunity for the deadly novel coronavirus. It could help guide decision-making about reopening businesses or schools. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, said Health Canada already has a mechanism to quickly evaluate the safety and effectiveness of health products approved in other developed countries. She also said Health Canada has significant concerns about the quality of some existing rapid antibody test kits and that products require an independent Canadian review. I just wanted to show you what the review looks like. Here's the Ontario Ministry of Health, Health Canada's drug review process for sale and marketing of a drug in Canada. Before a drug product is authorized for sale in Canada, the drug manufacturer must submit scientific evidence of the product's safety, efficacy, and quality to Health Canada for review and approval. The federal review process can take between 1 and 2 years, depending on the nature of the product. Once Health Canada approves the product for sale in Canada, a notice of compliance, NOC, and a drug identification number, DIN, for the product are issued. More details on Health Canada's process can be found on their website. Okay, and so that's the current process, but Jason Kenney's hoping to circumvent that by saying anywhere that has, UK, United States, a peer healthcare system that's approved a test or medication, we should be able to use that too. Back to this, on Monday, Kenney also criticized Tam's response to the pandemic. He said that Canada's government was wrong to keep national borders open to travelers from countries hit earlier by COVID-19. This is the same Dr. Tam who's telling us that we shouldn't close our borders to countries with high levels of infection, and who in January was repeating talking points out of the PRC, People's Republic of China, about no evidence of human-to-human transmission, despite Taiwan telling the WHO and China that they had evidence of human-to-human transmission. This guy is debunking this, and that's what the rest of the article is about, but I wanted to highlight this. Provinces, he says, don't have any experience in testing the safety of drugs and approving drugs, she said. Oh, not him. Sorry, he is referenced further down. The she in this is Professor Lorraine Hardcastle, Lorraine Hardcastle, an expert in health law, said Kenney's statements. She said Kenney's statements are problematic on several fronts. And then she said provinces don't have any experience in testing the safety of drugs and approving drugs. She said to send messages to Albertans that Alberta could all of a sudden do a better job of getting Canadians better access to devices and drugs, I think that's very false. Actually, I think what he said was that any other peer market could do a better job and fast track it, and they don't want to wait for you to play catch up, right? And here is BC Transplant, right? And I'm just showing you like BC Transplants provide funding and guidelines on medication for transplant patients, right? So the provinces have quite a robust portfolio on dealing with healthcare. So I think it's really disingenuous, regardless of their credentials. And this person's a University of Alberta health law professor, right? And he's trying to say the same thing, that this has no merit and they shouldn't be able to do this. But I think that in an emergency, if you have proof that a medication has efficacy, if you see Spain and France and the United States having success with a combination of medications, you should be able to access that outside of a study, right? And I'm not making the laws or anything to that effect, but that's essentially the argument that Jason Kenney's making. He's saying that why should we wait for Health Canada to corroborate these peer-reviewed studies, these working studies that are showing almost 100% recovery rates. Like, it's incredible. There was an old age home that had COVID-19. There were two old age homes. One had 120 beds, one had 135 beds. One person died in the 135 bed home because they used hydroxychloroquine, that according to the tweet I read. And out of the 120 patient facility, old age home, they had 35 deaths, and they did not use hydroxychloroquine. So when you've got stuff like that, and that's anecdotal, that's not an official study unless they were actually testing those. When you've got that, isn't it irresponsible? Isn't it against the rules of medication ethics to withhold that from potential patients? If you could save a life, wouldn't you? Why not? I don't understand. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. Here is the economic impact, and this is what I was going to be talking about earlier when I said Jason Kenney was talking about 25% unemployment. There's a comparison here to potentially like the Great Depression, and just for number of people percentage-wise out of work. But my goodness, it's concerning, right? That's why I'm talking about the economy so much, because the effects of this real or imagined virus, doesn't matter if it's real or imagined now, the economic effects are real and they're impacting people, and it needs to be dealt with, right? And that's what our politicians and our leaders are for. That's why you have to look at reopening the economy. We can't cower in our houses indefinitely. It doesn't work like that. Not even to wait for a vaccine. That's the absence of a plan. That's not a plan. Okay, back to this. Nearly 6 million people have applied for COVID-19 emergency benefits. Nearly 6 million people have applied for COVID-19 emergency aid benefits in the past month. Figures from Employment Minister Carla Qualthru's office show that more than half of them, 3.5 million, have applied for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, since applications opened April 6. The total figure of nearly 6 million includes those who applied through the Employment Insurance EI process, which will be streamed through CERB for the first 4 months. To date, close to 5.4 million of those 6 million aid claims have been processed. So that's a huge number of people. That's a lot of Canadians. And here is 30%. Okay, so this is the Great Depression in Canada. This is just from Wikipedia. So take it with a grain of salt, right? Significant results. By 1930, 30% of the labor force was out of work, and 1/5 of the population became dependent on the government for assistance. Wages fell, as did prices. Prices are not falling currently, except gasoline, but not diesel. Okay, back to this. Gross national expenditures declined 42% from the 1929 levels. That's only 1 year, right? Almost half. In some areas, the decline was far worse. In rural areas of the prairies, 2/3 of the population were on relief. Further damage was the reduction of investment. Both large companies and individuals were unwilling and unable to invest in new ventures. It is not possible to open a business right now unless you are opening an online business, which may be smart because you have a wider audience of customers potentially. You don't have to rely on the main square in your town. You can rely on the main square that is the internet, but it's hard to find traffic, right? But fundamentally, you can't open a watch store unless it's an essential service. You're not opening anything right now. So that applies, as does the high unemployment rate, 25%, 30% in the Great Depression, 25%, and we're just getting started. And unless we start really looking at what we can do for the economy, other than, I don't know, wait 2 years for a vaccine, right? That's not a plan. That is not a plan. That's like when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and one person in the party comes up with something stupid and everybody says, no, dude, that's dumb. And you move on and find the real plan. But unfortunately, that guy's in charge, right? He's the prime minister. Okay, back to this. Alberta's unemployment will likely surpass 25% of the COVID-19 pandemic, Premier Jason Kenney said Tuesday, and that's without factoring in the full impact of tanked oil demand and prices. Yeah, the Alberta crude is much lower than $10, and $10 is kind of the break even. Like, you're not going to make a lot of money, or any money, right? At $10, at $3, there's no point. So that's going to be an economic impact as well. That's going to hit at some point. That would be double the worst unemployment rate in the province in the last 4 decades. That's 40 years. This would be the most challenging period in our economy in relative terms since the Great Depression. There's simply no doubt about it, Mr. Kenney told an online energy symposium Tuesday morning. And yeah, I mean, there's no real way around that. Feds to fund quarantine of seasonal farm workers in Canada amid COVID-19. So we're looking at a massive, like Great Depression levels of unemployment, but we are paying $50 million to quarantine seasonal farm workers because Canadians won't do that work. I don't know. Canadian farmers and food processors will get $50 million in federal funding to ensure temporary foreign workers comply with mandatory COVID-19 quarantine. Agricultural Minister Marie-Claude Bibeau announced the money today, saying the workers are an essential part of keeping Canada's food supply open. What about summer jobs? What about all the students who, I mean, if we don't open the economy, are going to be looking for work? What about the 25% unemployment in Alberta? It just seems like we can't move Canadians there. We can't use that $50 million to get Canadians where they need to be to do this work, right? I don't understand. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I just don't get it, right? This globalist push to do everything, to outsource everything, right? Okay, maybe that's the best way. Maybe it's not. I don't know. The Globe and Mail is reporting Canada, U.S. in talks to extend border closures amid pandemic, sources say. U.S. and Canadian officials are holding talks that will almost certainly lead to an agreement to keep the land border closed to non-essential travel for at least another few weeks, sources say. The border between Canada and the United States was restricted to all non-essential travel on March 21st for a 30-day period that ends April 19th in an effort to stem this spread of COVID-19. The partial closing of the border did not affect essential travel, including truck and rail traffic carrying food and goods key to supply chains, as well as travel to work. Flights between both countries continue but have been restricted. The border closing also applied to migrants crossing the border by foot at informal crossings illegally, but not to temporary foreign workers who are needed by Canadian farmers and other producers. And not to temporary foreign students either, who don't have any schools to go to but are still allowed in. Sources who have knowledge of the talks say U.S. and Canadian officials are discussing whether to reopen the border to non-essential travel, although they say it's very unlikely that those restrictions would be lifted. The sources say the discussions are more focused on whether to extend the border restrictions for 2 weeks or another 30-day period. The Globe and Mail is not revealing the names of the sources because they were not allowed to publicly discuss the bilateral negotiations. Here is 680 News talking about Air Canada is suspending more international flights until June, where Air Transat and Sunwing Airlines are canceling all trips until May 31st due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can't leave Canada, generally. I mean, the land borders closed to non-essential travel. The air borders, everybody's canceling all their flights. Nobody's traveling anywhere. We can't leave. But every day, this is yesterday, Monday, April 13th, today is the 14th, flights land from China. And somebody, Joe Warmington, said to me he tweeted at me that he was going to look into this because it's not what people think it is. It's not what people are saying it is. So if I'm wrong about this, then okay, I'll be glad to admit that I'm wrong about this and that the border's closed tight. But I've seen the Rebel reporting from Pearson Airport, and it looks like there's a whole bunch of Chinese nationals landing in Canada daily. And I've seen Kian Bext go to the United States to see that Roxham Road was not so closed, in that it's closed to reporters now instead of closed to people trying to illegally cross. And I think that the United States, they have border patrol there, but it's not as closed as you'd think it is. So isn't it strange to be locked in your house with fines backing it up and absolutely no option to leave the country whatsoever? International flights are gone, land borders closed, but people are landing from China every day. Doesn't that seem just odd to you? Doesn't it seem like just weird? Like, wouldn't the basic level thing to do would be to stop flights from infected areas, right? Like, wouldn't you think that? And yet still not happening in Canada. Up to yesterday anyway. I don't have today's because I don't have time to look for it. Weird, isn't it? Thanks for watching, everybody. Check out CanadaPoly.com. Check out CanadaReport.co. And have a wonderful, wonderful